After they present their paper, we'll have roughly 5 minutes for discussion, but primarily questions specific to this particular presentation. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some more time to raise broader questions that maybe more than one of the presenters would like to respond to. So I think we can now begin. And so the first presenter is Sona Tajirian. And she's a third-year PhD student in the History Department at UCLA, under the supervision of my colleague Sebu Aslanyan and Richard Hovhannisyan, Professor of Modern Armenian History. She received her BA in 2009, MA in 2011, in Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies, both from the Faculty of Oriental Studies at Yerevan State University. Her main research interest, as you will see from her presentation in a moment, is the involvement of Armenian merchants from Julfa in the early modern diamond and gem trade between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean in the broader context of gem and diamond commodity chains in the early modern world. And so the title of the presentation, as you can see, that she's going to be illuminating us on is Matus, 1644 to 79, an Armenian diamond and gem merchant in Livorno and Venice. So, over to Sona. I think so, yeah, you may be try. If you don't, then just put it aside.
Can you hear me?
Yes, better with the speaker.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about, as Professor Cowie mentioned, about the 17th century Armenian diamond merchant in Venice. A brown leather-bound book kept under the number PD66C, as you can see here in Museo Mora di Venezia, called Tomar in New Julfan dialect, which literally means a roll. Belongs to Hoxha Minas from Minasan family firm and is at the same time a contract between him and his commander agent Agha Matos. Tomar, or the accounting ledger, contains inventory of commodities such as textiles, spices, but mostly white and yellow diamonds, turquoise, pearls, lazurite, rubies, etc. that Agha Matos and another dozen agents were supposed to sell in Izmir, Istanbul, Isfahan, and then in Frankistan, which in the New Julfa dialect means Europe, specifically Venice. This Tomar contains information, and this is the first page of the accounting ledger that I was talking about, and at the top you can see 3-4 lines where they actually state that they're signing a contract between the master in Isfahan and then his agent Agha Matos. This Tomar contains information about the cities in which Agha Matos and the other agents involved traded during 1679 and late 1680s, thus giving one a hint of a possible typical trade route of an Armenian diamond merchant, and demonstrating the span of long distances covered by early modern Armenian merchants, along with detailed information on the financial transactions recorded by Hoxha Minas himself. As a result of his long-time involvement in the diamond and gem trade between northern Italy and India, Agha Matos became one of the most influential Armenian merchants in Livorno, which after Venice was arguably the next most important trading settlement of the Julfan Armenian mercantile community during the early modern period. I'm sorry. As one of the pillars of the Armenian community in Livorno, Agha Matos was the principal benefactor of the city's Armenian church of San Gregorio Illuminatore, which you can see here. And what we see here is the facade of the church, and the rest of the church was destroyed in the result of bombings during World War II. So that's what we have right now. This church opened its doors in 1714. The amount of diamonds of different sizes and colors and other gems included in the inventory of the accounting ledger is very impressive. It clearly indicates that Agha Matos was a very successful gem merchant during the end of 17th and beginning of 18th centuries. My paper will look at Agha Matos' life as a diamond merchant and will shed light on the commercial biography of this important yet largely neglected merchant. By attracting the attention of scholars interested in early modern diamond and gem trade, it will treat Agha di Matos as broadly representative of a group of other Armenian merchants involved in diamond and gem trade of the early modern period. And when I say early modern period, I mean roughly the period covered from 1600s to 1800s. And this paper is actually only a part of a bigger project on the involvement of Armenian merchants in the early modern diamond and gem trade, and I hope to focus my dissertation on this topic. Now let's turn to Agha di Matos' life. In order to get some insights into his early life, I mostly relied on Mestre Bogolian's history of the Armenian community of Livorno and the building of their church, but I also relied on a dozen letters from the state archives of Florence, and more specifically the archive of the Livorno Armenian church that we saw a while ago. Bogolian was the Armenian priest of the St. Gregory the Illuminator Armenian church in Livorno during the 19th century. It's nearly impossible to identify the sources that he has used to write Agha's biography, but there is a possibility that he actually had access to this church's archive that I talked about, which then was sold by another priest and ended up in the state archives of Florence, and it's good because we would have lost it otherwise. So Agha was probably born in 1644, as Bogolian mentions that he was 65 years old when he died in 1709. We know next to nothing about his birthplace. However, in all the letters available to me, he's called Tarvasi, or the resident of Tabriz, which leads to two options, that he was from Tabriz city or Tabriz quarter in New Julfa, Isfahan. On 13th of September, 1709, Agha di Matos was wounded by his Georgian servant named Bejan, right in front of the Livorno Armenian church that was being built by the contribution of Agha di Matos himself. He was stabbed by knife 8 times right after he got out from the sermon, and was only found next day in the morning by people passing by in front of the church, who then took his body home. According to Halajan, Matos' servant killed him because of jealousy and anger. This had to do with the fact that Agha Matos had fired him from the position of workman superintendent. He was then taken to St. Cosmas and Damian's church in Livorno, where his body was kept for a number of years, after which it was taken to the newly built Armenian church, and he was buried there. Agha Matos had a son and a daughter named Hovannes and Lucia respectively, who were immediately informed about his death. They were not in Livorno at the time, his daughter being married to a person named Aslan Hagopian from Tabriz. His son Hovannes was a student at the Urbanian school in Rome. Bogolian gives no information on Agha di Matos' wife, but he assumes that she might have died in Iran. Coming to Livorno and not finding hospitality from the Armenian community there, according to Bogolian, Agha Matos' son-in-law had to finish the construction of the Armenian church using his own savings. He was not able to organize Agha's financial issues, which apparently meant that the late Agha had substantial debts. Aslan was also forced to sell his own property and spend his savings. The bad news also reached Tabriz, from where Agha's daughter Lucia and her son left for Livorno. Agha's daughter arrived at Livorno only to find her husband surrounded by creditors, the church closed, and her father's property confiscated. She then decided to ask from the prominent Armenians of Livorno to help her and her husband cover the debts that her late father had left. However, none of them was willing to help them. One can only guess as to why the prominent and the extremely rich Agha di Matos was neglected after his death by his own compatriots, and why did he have so many debts in the first place. Now let's turn to the accounting ledger and Agha di Matos' commercial activities. As it is clear from the accounting ledger, he had an impressive consignment containing diamonds and rubies, as well as pearls, turquoise, lazurite, which were being shipped or brought to him personally to Venice by different agents of the Minassian family firm. The accounting ledger of Hoja Minas consists of a number of mercantile transactions between the Komenda agent and the master in Julfa, Hoja Minas. Types of the diamonds he describes in the ledger are of different grades and colors, mostly white. I'm sorry, this happens because of our location. Types of the diamonds he describes in the ledger are of different grades and colors, mostly white, also yellow and red. In some cases, it is specifically mentioned that these are uncut or unpolished. And here is the almost complete list of commodities listed in the ledger, which clearly demonstrates that the gems and diamonds were the majority of the consignment. Among gems that are listed, one can find, as you see, apparently diamonds of different colors and sizes, rubies, turquoise, pearls, agate, lazurite, sapphires, crystals, pearl beds, and other gems. Listed also are covers and bedspreads from different textiles, including woolen covers, embroidered and decorative textiles, mainly from Southeast Asia. But you could also see silk, of course, was the first most important commodity that the Armenian merchants were trading with. Also rhubarb, musk, cardamom, ginger, wood, cotton from Gujarat, and many other commodities, but these were the main ones. Agadimatos was not the only person involved in implementing the terms and conditions of his and Hoca Minas's contract. There are apparently over 10 agents or couriers involved in the trading agreement between Agadimatos and Hoca Minas. These agents and couriers, as seen from the ledger, carry bulks of goods to be delivered to Aga in his final destination in Venice. It seems that Agadimatos is not traveling during these years, which is not common for an agent because agents would be hired by the masters so that they could travel all the time and trade. But in this case, it seems like Agadimatos was a very important person or a very important agent, so he was not traveling. He had those other agents, we could say, who would travel and trade for him. Instead, he's the person in charge of sales of the bulk of goods sent to him from Hoca Minas. Now, what were the primary factors that brought Agadimatos to Venice, followed by Livorno, to trade the diamonds shipped to him from India? What were the circumstances of the diamond and other gems trade in Venice and Livorno at that time? It was only in the 15th century that, after the advent of cutting and polishing techniques, that diamonds became objects of beauty and luxury. Diamond mines were mainly situated in the Indian subcontinent, and let's see if I can show this map. This is an 18th century map that I took from San Lazaro and just tried to pinpoint the Indian subcontinent. See if you can find the mines there. Private diamond trade became one of the important occupations of local merchants, only later to be replaced by corporations such as English and Dutch East India companies. Before that, diamond trade was not a state monopoly. It was a convenient commodity to trade with, and in fact, diamonds were also perfect for smuggling. You could have a bunch of diamonds in your pocket and almost no one would see it, right? What about Venice? Venice has traditionally been the most important silk trade center in the early modern Europe, and Jews and Armenians had started frequenting it from the second half of the 16th century. Venice was also the city where the famous Shehrimanyan or the Shehriman family resided and traded. Livorno, however, has arguably been one of the most important centers for coral and diamond trade. Italian city of Livorno was the perfect spot on the routes of diamond and coral trade stretching from India to the Mediterranean. So European merchants would sell diamonds from India in return for corals fished from the Mediterranean. In fact, coral along with silver was one of the main and few commodities that Asia was interested in from Europe. It was mainly used in traditional jewelry in India and thus was an important component in diamond and coral commodity chain. According to Francesca Trivellato, who has an excellent chapter on the exchange of Mediterranean coral and Indian diamonds, beginning from the mid-17th century, Livorno was a world center for coral trade and manufacturing. And it was also, and Livorno coral manufacturing was dominated by Jews and to a lesser extent by Armenians. This topic has not been researched at all, and in fact, the first documents that me and my advisor have found that state that Armenians were actually trading with corals was recently, like 2 months ago, so we haven't even scratched the surface. We'll see how it goes. And I'm concluding, I want to keep it short. Unfortunately, scholarly work on the involvement of Armenian merchants in the early modern gem trade has thus far been minimal. Seppo Aslanyan has touched upon Ahadi Matos and has excellently singled out the archival documents available for further research in his book on the Julfan Armenian trade network. However, the diamond trade falls outside the purview of his book. Aslanyan nevertheless mentions that among Armenians, and I'm quoting, the diamond trade was particularly important as it integrated the two poles of the Julfan network, Surat in India and Livorno, end of quote. Some Armenian authors, such as Arakel Davrijetsi, Harutun Kurdian, and others, have devoted chapters or articles to the discussion of Armenian merchants involved in the early modern gem trade. In addition to Trevelato and Van Nesten, others have touched upon the importance of the role of Armenian merchants in the early modern period, but have done so without properly situating the role of the Armenians in the larger scholarship of early modern world history in general and early modern economic history in particular. On the example of the Armenian diamond and gem merchant Ahadi Matos, this paper tried to shed light on his commercial biography and the details of this previously unpublished accounting ledger, thus hopefully preparing the ground for further research on Armenian merchants' involvement in the early modern gem trade between India and Europe. Thank you.
Okay, so we're ready to receive your questions. Any questions, any particular interest that this has sparked? Further information you would like to glean from our presenter?
Did he keep the records in Armenian?
Yes, if you can see from,
Yeah,
if you can see from here, this is the first page, and this is written in New Julfan dialect that the merchants used back in 17th, 18th centuries. You can read it if you know Armenian, but I cannot guarantee that you would understand it. But this is considered Armenian, yes. They would keep accounting ledgers, and they would keep very detailed information on each transaction that they had. And this ledger has more than, if I'm not mistaken, it's almost 30 pages, and it's very long. It's like a roll. Each page is this size.
So can you discern from these records as to how much this person was worth in terms of?
Yes, definitely you can. I don't know if you can see from here, but no one has worked on this material before. So we still have a lot of things to do, and I'm hoping to focus my research on this. And if I do that, if I write my dissertation, I'm definitely going to do that, yes. But I've seen a 75 carat worth diamond mentioned here. And it's only one of the diamonds. I mean, it's huge. But the whole list is consists, it's 80% of diamonds and other gems. So you can have a picture in your mind.
It would be worthwhile to compare him at the time that he did business as to whether he was General Motors or was it the corner auto shop. I mean, what was the size of this whole thing during the day? Was it just a few dollars or millions of dollars? It would be very nice to know that.
With the primary research that I have done, and the reason that I'm talking about Ahadi Matos especially right now, is that he was actually very, very rich. And if you look at the inventory, you can tell that. But you're right. We need to do a quantitative research. But just one more comment, and I haven't touched this in my paper yet. The reason I want to look at this subject is that there are 1 or 2 books and a couple of articles that mention that the monopoly of diamond trade in 17th and 18th centuries, and I'm not talking about the corporations, belonged to Jews and Armenians. But no one has written anything about Armenians. So this is one of the reasons I want to look at these documents too and see how it goes. But I can assure you that he has a very impressive inventory of commodities. Very impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Was Agha was rather unique, or there were other, as was a part of another bigger business taking place at the time? He was not the only one doing
No,
this.
definitely not.
So there was a trend of this kind of a business between.
Yes, there was a trend. There are a group of merchants that at least we know of, or we know their names. There is another merchant who was born in Jufa, Raphael de Rubli, and then he would trade mostly in France, Marseille, and Livorno, and he actually knew Agha Matos. I have one letter where they have a correspondence with each other. No, but we're not talking about one or two people. We're talking about a big group of Armenian merchants who would specialize in diamond trade.
And how long did this trade last? I mean, this is
not longer than a century. Mostly the second part of 17th century, and then the first part of 18th century, and then the corporations. Yeah.
Are there any records in Iran, New Jaffa, or somewhere about this Agha Matos, or has anybody looked into that, or?
No, no one has looked at Agha Matos or this subject. As I said, Dr. Aslanyan has touched upon him, and he acknowledged that there is this person, but he hasn't done research on him apparently. So most of this accounting ledger, and we don't have many. We have maybe 10, and only 2 of those are published accounting ledgers because they're very complicated. So it's not a very easy thing to do. So this is from Venice, Museo Borer Library. In San Marco, if you have been there. But the documents that I looked at in order to recreate Agha Matos' life are from the archives of Florence, the state archives of Florence. But there are also a couple of letters that I found recently in the summer in Venice from the Santa Croce, the Venice Armenian Church Archive, which no one has looked at yet. I'm still going through those documents. I just photographed those.
For curiosity, how much would a 75-carat diamond be worth back then?
I think about this size.
No, but I mean, how much?
The worth.
The worth back then.
Value.
In what value?
Monetary value. So
Back then.
that's what he's asking.
In terms of gold, for example, how many ounces of gold? Does it say anything about that or no?
There are different measures used in this accounting ledger, but I haven't done a lot of research on that. I can tell you right now.
Yes, in the back, yes.
Where was this diamonds coming from? Where was the source?
India.
And, how was the means of transportation? By caravan or by the ship? Or?
That's a very good question. So the mines are in India, mainly Golconda and the island of Borneo. That's where the main mines were around Hyderabad, and these were the most famous mines back then, until 18th century where they found mines in Brazil too. And about transportation, that's a very good question because here you have a problem of security, right? So if you're taking diamonds from India to, let's say, Italy, you use the land, so caravanserais, but you also use the ships, right? So it depends. It's part of it is land trade, land route, and then part of it is sea land. They would mostly take it to Izmir, and from Izmir they would take it to Venice. So India to Bandar Abbas, Iran, and then the land trade through Ottoman Empire, and then to Izmir. From Izmir they would embark on a ship and take it to Venice, take the bulks to Venice. It was a very long trip and full of pirates and not a secure trade route.
Yeah, you said Agha Matos started as a commando agent of Minassians. Did he always stay as a commando agent, or did he go on his own later on?
So this is what we have, at least the letters that I looked at, say that he was considered an agent, but it depends on what kind of an agent you are. If you invest more, it's a very complicated contract if you look at it. But as far as I can see and from what we have, he was still the agent of the Minassian family firm.
Throughout his life.
But he died in 1709, so he didn't live long. He was killed, as I said. But I think at the end of his life, he was not an agent anymore. But I'm just guessing. We don't have any information on that.
Yes, in the back. Yes.
Was there a demand in diamonds, a lot of demand for diamonds at the time? Or were they the pioneers of bringing diamonds in and marketing it to? Because I'm just curious if you found that in your research.
Yeah, I mentioned that the diamonds became objects of luxury and commodities that you would use for jewelry and other things only in 15th century in Europe at least. No, I'm not saying that Armenians or Jews or anyone was the first one to actually introduce the diamonds. I don't know about that, but there was a demand, of course. There was a demand. And mostly, why would these people take, why would these merchants take diamonds to Venice or Livorno, then Amsterdam and Marseille, is because, let's say Amsterdam and then Livorno were the world centers for cutting and polishing diamonds. Because these merchants would take raw diamonds from India. These were not cut and polished. So they would take it, sell it to someone else who would then take it to Amsterdam or Antwerp or Livorno, cut and polish, and then they would use it in jewelry. That's how it worked.
Do we have any information as to how he incurred this massive amount of debt towards the end of his life?
No. No, and the details that I had about his biography, I just recreated it from 12 to 15 letters in an archive of 1,000 documents. But I'm sure if I look at it more, I might find more.
Right.
I just found letters that were written, let's say, from his daughter to her mom, or her mom, like Matos' wife, to her son, and that's how I was able to find out that his wife lived in Tabriz, they had a house, who their neighbors were. But these are just, letters in a huge archive.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, we certainly wish you well in pursuing this further. Yeah. Okay, so I think we'll move on now to the second presenter. This is Catherine J. Franklin. She's been working as an archaeologist in the Armenian Republic for the last 6 years. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago in 2014. Her dissertation was entitled, "This World is an Inn, Cosmopolitanism and Caravan Trade in Late Medieval Armenia." It embraces princely performances as well as roadside garbage, and examines how the landscapes of local and global were constructed and imagined by Armenians situated along the highways of what is now called the Silk Road. Catherine's most recent publications treat her excavations of the medieval village of Ambroi in the province of Aragatsotn. She is the co-author of the forthcoming volume entitled Incomplete Archaeologies, Assembling Knowledge in the Past and Present. And as you can see, the topic of her presentation is a route of trade and road to progress, the Silk Road in medieval and contemporary Armenian politics. So, all yours.
In the 1270s AD, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Marco Polo, the now famous Venetian merchant, was on his way east to the court of the great Kublai Khan. While passing through Cilicia in the South Caucasus, Polo described the Armenians who, quote, reside in the cities and fortified places and gain their living by commerce and manufacture. Marco Polo was traveling along a route that, in the mid-13th century, bore any number of names, but which has come in the subsequent centuries in large part due to the fame of travelers like Polo himself to be known as the Silk Road. The idea of a Silk Road carrying trade and travelers between the Far East and the West, like the silken strands the term evokes, acts as a strong and tanglesome force within the imaginations of historians, archaeologists, economists, politicians, policymakers, and increasingly the public. In popular discourse and advertising, the Silk Road is deployed to spark appetites for tastes from afar, whether in food, music, touristic destinations, or illicit goods. Between recent coverage of internet drug trafficking, which uses Silk Road as a concept synonymous with black market bazaar, and the conversations around Netflix's new series called Marco Polo, which ensnares viewers with sensual excess bound up within the phrase the exotic Silk Road. Lately, I'm less and less surprised when I hear that other people are familiar with the Silk Road as a medieval phenomenon. But what does surprise me is to encounter others who are aware of the relative modernity of the idea of a Silk Road as such, given that the term itself is relatively new, only coined during the course of Ferdinand Freiherr von Richthofen's research in 1877. So this tendency to get tangled in our own imaginaries when it comes to the Silk Road extends to the present day. We still struggle with separating what the Silk Road means to us and what trade and travel in Eurasia might have meant in the past. Recent literature produced by the United Nations World Tourism Organization claims that Silk Road as a social concept dates back to at least 100 years BC, but the Silk Road as an imaginary shapes approaches to the Bronze Age and earlier periods in Eurasia as well. Meanwhile, discussions on infrastructural developments in Eurasia, like the Trans-Asian Railway or Iron Silk Road, suggest that the Silk Road phenomenon continues today, merely transforming what is traded and how it is carried. So for instance, in a recent article in the New York Times, the Silk Road was evoked as a historical passageway which was once worn to a dense chain of dusty trails by caravans and horses, carrying merchants and their many wares between continental Asia and Europe. And today, it takes the form of a series of transnational rail tracks transporting the latest in electronic products and computer parts. So in the next few minutes, I want to briefly suggest that this then-now direct comparison, then spices, now microchips, is a little bit misleading, in that it implies that the Silk Road is a transhistorically consistent phenomenon or economical entity. At the same time, I want to explore the ways in which the phenomenon of trade and exploration that we now call the Silk Road was powerful in the medieval period as it is today, specifically for Armenia and in the South Caucasus. So in both medieval and in contemporary discourse, the Silk Road as an imagined concept, has significantly impacted politics in Armenia as a concept shaping how Armenians situate themselves in relations to worlds of commerce and culture bigger than Armenia. The idea of a Silk Road has the potential to draw people into collaboration across borders, but it is also a source of power, which can draw the limits of the political world according to some pretty narrow agendas. So Armenia was made famous in the medieval period through the descriptions of travelers who wrote accounts of the cities, markets, people, and products of the highlands. As critical to the social world of medieval Armenia as our cities and towns were the trade routes that crisscrossed the mountains, connecting Central Asia, the Volga Basin, the Near East, and the Black Sea coast. And these roads extend far beyond the routes that Zona was just describing, the overland routes of trade that pre-existed the ocean routes in the later centuries. Travelers who rode in caravans along these routes passed not only through the spectacular landscapes of the highlands, but also through the political realms of the Armenian princes who administered the highlands from the mid-1st millennium AD through the early modern period. After the Georgian reconquering of Armenia from the Seljuk Empire in the late 12th century, an echelon of princes repopulated what is now the Republic of Armenia with their mercantile ventures and their geopolitical aspirations. So in concrete terms, these medieval political figures were called Prince of Princes or Lord among Lords, and their inscriptions built up their power to rule in places like Shirok and Ararat-Soden and Bayazor by weaving together their princely authority with the wealth and mystique of the trade highways. So to act as a medieval merchant prince in Armenia, these Armenians had to do multiple things at once. They carried out what Mukhtar Goshetsi called the prerogative of kings, building bridges and roads through their administered lands. They also built castles to protect themselves and their territories, where they renovated extant fortresses like Anberg, which just showed, which perhaps some of you have visited. And they constructed beautiful churches for their Christian communities and dedicated these structures to their own memory and that of their lords. The Georgian Mukharjalis, or in Cesar Arbelian's case, who built the caravanserai at Selim, to the Mongols as well. Much like their contemporary Seljuks, these Armenian princes were also merchants. They owned partial or full shares of mills, shops, banks, hostelries, farms, wineries, and various other forms of medieval industry in towns and cities. And they And they undertook projects which wove together these two worlds. So the main example of which is the building of caravan inns along the highways. The numerous remaining caravanserai in Armenia, including this one in Operon, near Operon, which I excavated in 2011, or the more famous caravanserai at Salim, show facilities for both humans and horses to be made comfortable. Recent scholarship has argued that highway travel was such a crucial part of late medieval life, that hospitality to strangers formed a core part of chivalric codes in both Christian Armenia and Seljuk Anatolia during this period. So that means that to be a successful politician in medieval Armenia meant caring for a public that was made up of not just villagers and people in towns, but of travelers like Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, and thousands of other people whose names are not famous from history books. And here's a view of the inside of that caravanserai, the size it would have been for people on horses. So trade along the highways was, in medieval Armenia, not just a source of glass, silk, spices, fine woods, horses, or perfumes, or gemstones later, but also a real source of political influence. So over the last few decades in particular, since the collapse of Soviet control of the Caucasus, American involvement in the region has been driven by interest in the strategic location of the Caucasus for transport and access, as well as its rich energy resources. Fascinatingly, initiatives for economic development in the Caucasus and adjoining Eurasia, as well as the trans-border cross-cultural collaborations, so security initiatives, which are required to get these developments off the ground, have been consistently framed within the imaginary of the Silk Road, so as a metaphor. Central to the use of Silk Road as a concept in these cases is the consistent construal of Silk Road as a unifying web of mutually beneficial interactions that transcends partisan politics and local histories, just as it is assumed to have done in the past, a time before familiar sources of conflict like states, total wars, or global capital. This was the effect of the political language which described the opening of the BTC, or Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, oil pipeline which runs from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea through the territories of Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, carrying oil from the Caspian reserves to the Western market. So as the taps were opened in 2005, then President of Turkey, Ahmet Necdet Sezer, addressed the crowd saying, "This is the Silk Road of the 21st century." This pipeline forms part of what is called the East-West Energy Corridor through the Caucasus, bringing petroleum from Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan across the Caspian to energy-hungry Western markets. So the same emphasis on the Silk Road is this free flow of energy, free flow of goods and people that transcends or even ameliorates political tension is also at the heart of the United States' new Silk Road strategy, which was put into action in January 2013 with the ratification of the UN Treaty for Collaborative Construction of the Europe-Asian Railway. And so the Republic of Armenia is geopolitically and historically situated in relation to not only to the ancient Silk routes and their archaeological remains, but also to these contemporary developments drawing conceptually on the Silk Road as an imaginary which seeks to connect the raw materials and merchandise of the East with Western markets. So in the brief time remaining, I'll explore how attempts to develop Armenia's medieval Silk Road heritage as the basis of a tourism economy overlap in surprising ways with the interests and projects of transnational development and security initiatives focused on trade and transport. So drowning in paper. Though the care of Armenia's archaeological and architectural heritage is overseen by several state institutions, the funds for renovation, publicity, and international awareness of that archaeological heritage are overwhelmingly, or have been overwhelmingly, in the hands of the National Competitiveness Foundation of Armenia, a public-private entity. So the foundation was recently tasked with branding Armenia as a destination for tourists and investors, and was provided with 65 million drawn from the government to do so. Efforts to create a sustainable tourism strategy for Armenia have resulted in the creation of, quote, tourism corridors, routes of cultural value and roads to economic development. A major focus of tourism development at the present moment is the so-called Southern Corridor from Vayotsor through Army wine country to Gorsk in the east, where tourists will cross the border into the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. Initiatives underway by the NCF and the Armenian government involved developing the medieval monastery of Tatev as a terminus and the corridor itself, which you can see on the map in red, as a scenic route. So Yegnazor, including Arni, Cave, and Norvank, Jarmuk, Sisyan, Goris, and Tatev are clusters of what are called resource concentration within this corridor of cultural value, each of which, quote, rationalizes and focuses the local area for investment in tourism development. The Southern Corridor has been chosen as the pilot project for the General Tourism Development Corridors project, which is in preparation for Armenia as a whole, and the first steps in this project included the designation of the Southern Corridor as part of the Black Sea Silk Road Corridor by the American ambassador John Heffron in Norvank in 2013, and the construction of the Tatev Aerial Tramway in 2010. So, the Silk Road as a concept stressing medieval fluorescence, like the peak of Armenian civilization in the medieval period, cuts very close to the heritage identity of the Republic of Armenia. The great majority of sites listed for Armenia on the Black Sea Silk Road Corridor site on their website are medieval. More generally, medieval archaeology is central to Armenian self-representation, both in terms of UNESCO World Heritage designation and in terms of its tourism branding. All of the designated UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Armenia, as well as all of the sites submitted for consideration to be World Heritage Sites, are medieval or dominated by a medieval component. So the bridges, castles, caravanserai, and churches built by the late medieval princes, such as Cesar Orbelian, along this closely managed branch of the medieval Silk Road, are thus now central to achieving the projected growth in tourism in Armenia over the next decade and a half. So based on the current figures and projected assumptions, 0.9 million tourists are expected to visit the southern corridor of Armenia in 2030, generating an annual revenue of up to $350 million. So these efforts to develop heritage tourism in the southern corridor overlap the development of routes of trade and commercial flow through Armenia and the greater east-west corridor through the Caucasus. The North-South Highway, an ongoing project in Armenia, is intended to smooth the flow of traffic and goods between the Georgian and Nagorno-Karabakh borders. This highway is in turn part of the developing Eurasian North-South Transport Corridor, intended to link Russia and India over land, to quote, catalyze trade across Eurasia by linking expansive markets while significantly reducing transport cost. The cost previously from being that of taking, it's like such an amazing parallel to your paper, of taking goods from the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean by ship, which was much higher than taking, amazingly much higher than putting them on trucks and taking them through Armenia. So Armenia is the shortest route for this trade, and so Armenia is a major corridor both for new highways and for sections of the Trans-Asian Railway, or the Iron Silk Road I mentioned earlier. These highways and railways will pass through Vaidzor and Goris, linking Armenia to Iran through the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. This planned railway, called the quote, key missing link in the International North-South Transport Corridor, will open in 2022 and will carry a projected 18.3 million tons of cargo annually, serving as the transport counterpart to the petrochemical conduit of the BTC pipeline, which, as you may have noticed or just know, does not pass through Armenia. The roads connecting Armenia to Georgia's ports and Iran's markets are expected to solve the crisis of landlockedness for Armenia, ushering in a new era of prosperity to rival the medieval heyday of trade entrepôts like Ani and Dvin. So the idea of the Silk Road has proven inspiring to heritage professionals as well as politicians and petrochemical developers as a romantic and alluring route which catches at the imagination and brings foreign delights as well as seeming certain wealth. From a perspective between past and present, we can see an interesting parallel in Silk Road politics in Armenia. So between those merchant princes who built their prestige as hosts to travelers and traders and transported goods in the medieval period, and the contemporary ministers, bankers, and corporations which are interested in branding Armenia as part of the Silk Road of the 21st century. The emphasis of heritage discourse is on generating effective development strategies, and the center of these strategies is branding or brand story. For those of you who don't know, a brand story is like a narrative, a compelling narrative that comes to mind every time a name is said. So every time you think Armenia, you would think of the narrative of the Silk Road the same way that every time you say Apple computers, you think of the narrative of like easy to use, friendly technology. Yeah, exactly. Something like that. So a ready-made brand story is provided by the development initiatives attached to highway and railway projects underway in Armenia and other parts of the new Silk Road, that places like Armenia are corridors of wealth, superhighways for the flow of development and dollars from east to west. The easy slippage between the Silk Road as a metaphor and medieval Silk Road heritage encourages a unity between the story of Armenia's past and the trajectory of its future development. And yet, today, as in the time of Marco Polo and Tigran Honans, travel in Eurasia is a political game, and a high-minded emphasis on the Silk Road as a highway to riches will leave out the potential losers of that game, usually local stakeholders in underdeveloped regions and the fragile archaeological landscape itself. For instance, while the Silk Road landscape of Vayat-Zor and Syunik is being actively developed for tourism and industry, it is relatively or even extremely under-researched scientifically, constituting an understudied region within a generally underrepresented period, the medieval period, in Armenian archaeology. The impetus to develop the region to entice, accommodate, and expand tourism is creating a time-critical challenge for archaeological site preservation and scientific research in Vayat-Zor and northern Syunik. Local people are taking an interest in this heritage as a source of regional identity and potential development, which is amazing. Meanwhile, site interpretation and preservation, if it occurs, remains a confrontation between these local stakeholders and predominantly foreign public-private organizations or NGOs. So as global interests race to buy into the Silk Road of the future, archaeologists, historians, and cultural management professionals need to claim their seats in the metaphorical caravan, lest the medieval sites, which Armenia's Silk Road reputation is based, get left behind. Thank you. Now I look forward to your questions.
Very stimulating paper, raising issues connected with two very different periods and their linkage in the contemporary discourse. Any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I know you're interested in archaeology, but do you know the capacity of that crude oil pipeline?
Ooh.
And does Armenia get any transit tariffs?
Oh, for the pipeline. Well, that's just the issue. The pipeline does not in any way pass through Armenia.
Does it?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, yeah, a lot of these measures for overland transport along the railways and the highways are sort of workaround operations to sort of parallel, but also sort of compensate for like the lack of participation by Armenia in that pipeline. Yeah, they went to a lot of trouble, both sort of politically and in terms of infrastructural development to bypass Armenia in the building of the pipeline.
Any other questions? Well, I have to say, I would love to know more about the caravanserai that you were involved in excavating near Avaran. What information do we have about it? Any information about who was involved in its construction, how long it functioned, those sorts of things. Are there any inscriptions or other material that would give us some sort of...
Absolutely. A lot of this information is contained in my dissertation, which I will send anyone if you ask for it, though I warn you, it is a dissertation. So according to research done by like several generations of Armenian archaeologists and historians, the caravanserai that I worked, if any of you have been to Aparan, taken the marshutka from Yerevan to Tbilisi, the caravanserai that I excavated, I can put those pictures up, is located just on the slope of Aragats, Mount Aragats, just west of the main highway. And it was built according to some inscription evidence which has now been lost in the last century, but that Toros Taramanyan, the famous architectural historian, recorded in his 1940 surveys. It was built in the year 1213 by a prince named Vache Vachityan, who was, and the Vachityans were quite famous in Aragatsotn. For instance, they renovated places like Hovanavank and Samozavank, built places like Teher monastery, and also like renovated and added on to Hakpat and Sanahin. which are like all amazingly famous places in the medieval landscape of Armenia. And they were appointed by the Makharjalis, or as they're known in Armenia, the Zakarian generals of the Georgian crown. So Vache Vachichan and his sons, his son Kurd, as part of being sort of like part of being this like local. I mean, so they ruled the large territory known as Nig Aparan, which went all the way from where Hakpat and Sanahin are now located down to near Ashtaroth. Part of their the sort of noblesse oblige, as you was not just endowing churches and donating sort of revenues from farms to the churches that they built, but also, as I sort of indicated, making sure that the travelers through their lands would have somewhere nice to stay. And also, it was kind of expected, it was requested by churches at the time that princes build caravanserais so that, let's say, the more unsavory aspects of highway travel not be put up in the free lodging provided by monasteries during this time. You can see this in like a late medieval law books. It's like, it would be really nice if princes could build hotels so that the dancing girls and minstrels that travel along with these princes would not have to stay in the free rooms that monasteries provided. So the if any of you have ever seen pictures of or been to Selim, even though it was about 100 years earlier, it was very similar in structure. It would have been a very nice, not a particularly beautiful building, but very warm. And it had troughs running along the sides just at the Selim for the donkeys or horses to be tied up, and then a nice warm floor in the middle for people to sleep in. Let's see. I could go on and on. It was my home for several weeks while we excavated it. The things you find during archaeology, for instance, we found in the excavated soil, we found the bones of starlings and owls. So we had this like nice evidence that, you can imagine contemporaries of Marco Polo traveling along the Silk Road, staying with their donkeys, which was probably dark, kind of smelly, in this caravan inn, and having starlings and owls flying in and out of the rafters of this building while they were sitting in there like eating their harissa and presumably telling stories about, I don't know.
That's for sure.
Debating, telling stories, negotiating, doing what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
So the monks didn't get any revenue from overnight guests who stayed, and they didn't get any revenue at all?
Well,
it was for free?
So they did, but very indirectly. So this is, okay, someone's going to have to stop me, because otherwise I'll talk about this for an hour. Very indirectly. So if you went to a monastery, if you're traveling and you went to a monastery, they would put you up for, you could request to stay for free. And likewise, you could also stay for free if you had no money, hypothetically. There's some debate about this. At one of these inns.
Merchants, they're making money.
But the merchants would pay a fee for food, and they would pay a fee to keep their goods safe in one of these inns, unless you were you were traveling with particular dispensations. And then the princes like Vache Vachichan and his sons, or Tigran Honens, who built the Church of St. Gregory, donated to the Church of St. Gregory in Ani, they would donate those incomes to the monks often. Like Tigran Honens' inscriptions recorded that he donated this kind of income from these caravanserai to his monasteries. So that's the way they would get the money. It's all tied together.
I think that you raised a very important point with regard to archaeological examination of sites, preservation, etc., and the need for that, and on the one hand, how little measures are actually being put in place in order to pursue that, but at the same time, I noticed you had that image of Sambata Bert, and of course that has been excavated and has been partly restored, but one might argue not in the best proper way, and that in fact it's been very, very slipshod in using wrong materials, regular cement there, etc. And exactly in many ways it might have been better if it had escaped attention rather than this sort of unwanted attention that it actually garnered.
I mean, it's a difficult point because obviously I want to say that there is such a thing as bad publicity for archaeological sites. Though, as a medieval archaeologist, I do want people to share my love for this historical landscape in Armenia. As you all no doubt know, like and as I was saying, like the medieval landscape, these churches and bongs and fortresses are already so important to like Armenia's like sort of our imagination of Armenia as a place to go and to remember and to love. The idea then that if we're going to, it would be better, at this point it would be better to leave them under the dirt than to sort of what now is happening is like, as one of my favorite caravans-rai, which is a beautiful place, different from Ashtarak to Tallinn. There's a town called Aruch, and there's a caravanserai there that some local history lover decided to renovate in this sort of amateur way. And so now you can imagine all of the, for me, wonderful garbage was cleaned out of the inside of the building, and then a bunch of concrete was poured on the top of it. And so it's now a fun place to go have a picnic. You can sit on top of the wall, but there's a lot of information that was lost about the kind of people who stayed there, and like the kind of stories we can tell about this Armenia's Silk Road history.
If there are no more questions for Kate, then we'll move on to speaker number 3, Stephen Rieg. Stephen received his BA in History and Russian and East European Studies from the University of Kansas in 2009, and his MA in History from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 2012. He is currently a PhD student there, working on his dissertation entitled Claiming the Caucasus, the Evolution of Russian Imperialism in Armenia, 1801 to 1894. Between August 2013 and January 2015, Rieg conducted archival research in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Yerevan. Since 2011, he has served as the student director of the American Research Institute of the South Caucasus. And the title of his presentation tonight is Spies and Settlers, Armenians in Tsarist Service, 1804 to 1813.
Thank you, Dr. Cowie. Thank you to all of you for being out here this evening, and especially thank you very much to the ARPA Institute for inviting us to come tonight. Russia looked to Armenian collaboration to facilitate its expansionist ambitions as soon as it entered the inter-imperial politics of the South Caucasus with the annexation of the Georgian kingdom of Kartli-Kakhetia in 1801. For the next several decades, the aims of Tsarist agents and the hopes of the region's Armenians coincided. This presentation examines the ways in which the Russian Empire relied on Armenians with their eager participation to advance into Persian territory, secure its new domains, and to settle newly conquered territory in the first 15 years of the 19th century. Just weeks before his assassination in March 1801, Tsar Paul tasked the supreme Russian military commander in the Caucasus, General Karl Heinrich Noring, with expanding the Romanov realm in the Persian-controlled South Caucasus through diplomatic means. The Tsar cautioned the general, quote, "Do not seek new territorial acquisitions aside from those that voluntarily search for my patronage. It is better to have allies interested in an alliance than unreliable subjects," end quote. Paul made clear which of the indigenous national groups he had in mind. "Look to attract Armenia," he wrote, quote, "into rapprochement for and through trade, in order to establish avenues through them and maintain their privileges, but institute our order," end quote. More explicitly, the Tsar identified Armenians as the key to expanding Russian borders and influence in the region. Quote, engaged now not in conquest, but in acquisition through the voluntary consent of Armenia, end quote. Paul had good reason to expect Armenia's cooperation. Tsarist Armenian subjects had enjoyed exclusive economic rights in Russia since the mid-17th century. At the same time as Paul issued these orders to General Noring, a large Armenian community in Constantinople sought Russian permission to relocate from the Ottoman capital into Crimea, and the Russian agents eagerly approved this appeal. Paul's successor, Alexander, shared his father's commitment to the utilization of Armenians in Russian imperialism. In September 1801, Alexander emphasized to Noring that his, quote, particular attention must be given to the attraction into Georgia of settlers from abroad, especially Christians, end quote. These colonizers were to be granted fertile land, as well as various assistance, benefits, and privileges. Among the Christian communities living in Ottoman and Persian territories adjacent to Georgia, Armenians were specifically targeted for these relocation efforts. Alexander's instructions to Noring in this regard were unequivocal. Quote, I place under your particular attention the attraction of the Armenian nation through various kindnesses. This method, owing to the large population of this people in regions adjacent to Georgia, is one of the most reliable ways for increasing the regional population's strength and also for ensuring the dominance of Christians. To this end, I decree that you demonstrate whatever possible patronage of the Echmiadzin Patriarchal Monastery and maintain friendly relations with its head, end quote. Foreign Armenians had been enticed by economic privileges in Russia since the 17th century. But with the turn of the 19th century, their economic role assumed a broader dimension. Armenians became, in essence, the frontiersmen of Russian expansion. Several closely intertwined factors amalgamated to grant Armenians this status in the Russian political imagination. First, their real and mythologized economic prowess under difficult political and social conditions was seen as a sign of Christian resilience in hostile environments, underscoring the Russian attraction to settling new domains with economically capable residents. Second, the ecumenical bond between Orthodox Russians and Apostolic Armenians, the majority of whom remained under the rule of the Shah and the Sultan, provided the kind of guarantee of loyalty that the Tsar sought in recruiting colonizers. Third, Russian agents excuse me. Third, Russian agents often exaggerated and took advantage of Persian and Ottoman Armenians' minority status in those empires to advocate for their resettlement into ostensibly more welcoming and egalitarian Tsarist communities. Tsar Alexander summarized some of these perceptions excuse me, to General Pavel Tsitsianov in late 1802. Quote, Armenians, as an industrious people that holds in its hands the entire trade of this part of the Orient, deserves your particular attention and protection. For given its persecution in Persia, there can be no doubt that the majority of that people will settle in Georgia as soon as they feel themselves provided with an orderly government, end quote. Armenians heeded the Russian calls. During the First Russo-Persian War in particular, significant numbers of Armenians significant numbers of Armenians crossed the imperial frontier and entered Russian subjecthood. I'm sorry, I didn't say cold.
Yeah, maybe you should take a break. I mean,
Yeah, take a break.
some of my place to say maybe. but-
I'll try to read a little more if I can. Most frequently, Armenian Meliks defected from Persia to Russia with their Armenian peasants. One of the earliest examples dates to the summer of 1804, when several Armenian Meliks fled from Yerevan to Russian territory in anticipation of the approaching Russian army. These hereditary Armenian nobles brought with them over 200 families of their peasants. As soon as they reached the haven of Tiflis, they immediately petitioned local Russian officials to rescue the remaining Armenians from Yerevan. These Armenians also provided tactical information about the size and strength of the Persian contingent, a transmission that would become a staple of Russo-Armenian engagement in the South Caucasus for the next several years. In particular, the Armenians not only provided tactical information, but also requested noble status within the Russian society. The Meliks, in fact, from all the evidence that I have seen, often were admitted by the Russians into the Russian table of ranks with all of its rights and privileges. Such flexibility evinced the Romanov Empire's desire to secure the loyalty and trust of the non-Tsarist subject Armenians. In the last stages of the war, with Persian forces on the retreat, Tsarist troops freed captured Armenians and resettled them into Russian territory. In one such example from December 1812, Russian soldiers liberated approximately 15,000 Armenians that had been captured by Persian forces near Lenkaran and brought them to Russian-held Karabakh. Active Armenian participation in the Russian war effort of 1804-13 manifested itself primarily in the form of intelligence gathering. Broadly speaking, these activities fell into two categories: Persian Armenians sneaking out of Yerevan and other khanates to Russian camps, and Russian officials dispatching Armenians on specific espionage missions. Moreover, Armenians also served as key intermediaries between Russian and Persian negotiators, often playing the role of reliable broker between the two sides. Successive Tsarist commanders in the Caucasus relied on the reports and information provided by Armenians to formulate strategy, ascertain Persian and Ottoman actions, and communicate with entities where the Russian presence was impossible. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very sorry about the coughing. This started earlier, but I thought it was going to be fine tonight. But
We've all been there.
We got the message.
Very interesting paper on a relatively little examined period, exposing, I think, some very significant data regarding the Armenian role in this very crucial development in the early 19th century. So I'm sure it's provoked a number of questions among the audience. Who would like to start us off?
Who was the first Melik that actually passed to the Russian side, and do you have any ideas? Or
I don't know his individual information, but I know that in terms of the time, it was in the summer of 1804, and it was even before the Russians were very close, but they knew that they were coming down from Tiflis. So I don't know his name, and I don't know his exact the size of the community that he brought with him. But the first wave of Armenians coming in included, according to the Russian sources, over 200 families. And after them, you had several other waves that were as large as 500 to 600 families. So by some of these Russian estimates, they always list the numbers in terms of hundreds or thousands of families. And you can estimate from that between 3 to 5 individuals, perhaps even 3 to 6 individuals per family. The example I gave from December 1812, that's a very conservative estimate that I came up with myself, 15,000. The Russian sources in that example cite 3,000 families. So potentially that number could be well over 20,000 individuals, but there's clear evidence that it was a very steady flow.
This may be a different question. How does this correlate time-wise with Russia being attacked by Napoleon and the French? We went all the way to Moscow. Had anything to do with it at all, or?
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of the international context because Russia was aware that Persia was negotiating with Napoleon during this time. In fact, I have this in a different paper part of this chapter. This is part of my dissertation chapter. Through Armenian informants, the Russians find out that Napoleon has dispatched senior negotiators, senior generals to the Shah in 1806, 1807 to request permission to march his army through Persia and attack Russia through the South Caucasus, through the Caucasus. And as far as I've been able to tell from Russian sources, Armenian individuals were the first people to inform the Russians of this potential threat. The Shah declined the request. He didn't let Napoleon march through his territory. But that tri-imperial dynamic is very interesting because each side is trying to play each other off. And with the Ottoman Empire being in the mix as well, nobody trusted each other, and alliances were often forged for just a matter of months before they were broken.
Any other questions? One thing that interests me is, and this is a broader question, as you mentioned, the openness of the Russians, so fundamentally they are Eastern Orthodox, they are Chalcedonian, vis-a-vis the non-Chalcedonian Armenian Apostolic Church, and how far this policy differs very, very markedly from, for example, the situation, of course, several centuries earlier in the Byzantine realm, where there were all sorts of attempts at negotiation between Byzantium and Armenia, but they always fell over this one issue that continually the Byzantines insisted that Armenians should accept Chalcedonian Orthodoxy before there could be any sort of union or development of relations between them. Whereas here we see that this was not imposed as a request on the part of the Russians. So I was very curious, is this purely pragmatism, or it's a sort of greater broad-mindedness on the part of also then the higher Russian clergy, etc., or how would you explain that?
It's, in my opinion, it's really just bona fide realpolitik. It's politically motivated incentives. I see no evidence at this time period that the Russians are trying to promote the notion of communion between the two churches.
Right.
Or, they're not even culturally trying to assimilate, acculturate the Armenians. What they are interested in are using that ecumenical bond, despite the very conspicuous differences, to win the Armenians over to their side, which they are able to do for most of this period.
Yes.
But I think this is very much a politically motivated actions that the Russian Empire is taking. They're not really concerned yet about the religious aspect.
Right. Although actually you could argue that in the later 19th century, the Armenians gained enormously from being under Russian rule because fundamentally because they were not in communion, the Armenian church was left untouched in contrast to the Georgian church, which was completely subsumed to the Holy Synod in St. Petersburg, and so lost a lot of its individuality, its rights, and so on, but precisely because it was in communion.
Absolutely, and it did come under pressure later on in the century, the Armenian church did, but early on that was not as much of a factor as it would be several decades later.
Right. One other question I had along the same sort of lines, that so the Armenian relations with Russia at this time, of course, were divided between these two centers of Echmiadzin and Galatasaray. I was very curious, you mentioned that, so was it Tsar Paul and the emphasis for maintaining good relations with Echmiadzin. I was very curious what the perspective was vis-a-vis this other Catholic that was in rivalry with Echmiadzin, still, I think, to some degree at this point.
I think in this instance, they are targeting specifically the Armenians who reside in northern Persia, who were devoted to Echmiadzin. And so that is why the focus at this time is on the followers of the Echmiadzin patriarch, because the regional reach of the monastery really affected the territory that the Russians were seeking. And so their primary focus in the first 15 years is on Echmiadzin. Later on it switches farther east.
Right, right.
Let me ask, what was the motivation of the Armenians to spy for the Russians?
They wanted to relocate into the Russian sphere, despite the fact that we have books by George Bournizian and others which argue that in the early 19th century, Armenians didn't actually have that bad under the Shah. Armenians still wanted to live under the rule of a Christian.
These Armenians are Persian Armenians?
Yes, Persian Armenians.
Not the Ottoman Empire Armenians.
I'm mainly talking about Persian Armenians here,
Okay,
although soon you'll have Ottoman Armenians from Anatolia, from Akhatsi, from other cities, from Kars, doing the same thing. And in fact, I wasn't able to get to it right now because of my cough, but I did discuss the fact that Russians also relied on Armenians from Anatolia to provide similar information. In fact, they often dispatched Armenians from Tiflis to monasteries and churches across the border in the Ottoman Empire to find out what the local conditions were, what the local political military leaders were up to. But for the most part, this is concerning Persian Armenians.
If there are no more questions for Stephen, then we'll move on to our fourth speaker, Urban Yaksha. And he received his BA in International Relations and MA in Political Theory from the University of Ljubljana, and has earned a certificate in Political Studies from the Sciences Po Bordeaux. Urban is currently pursuing his PhD in Politics at the University of York, focusing on the geopolitics of unrecognized states in post-Soviet Europe. He has worked as a research fellow in Yerevan and served as editor-in-chief of the journal Politikon. Urban has traveled extensively in the wider Caucasus region and has participated in more than 40 international conferences. His research focuses on the critical geopolitics of Caucasia. And the topic of his presentation tonight is geopolitics of genocide, comparing the Ottoman and Russian Empire's ethnic cleansing policies against Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, and Circassians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So,
thank you very much, Professor Kawi. Good evening, Borierico. Since I'm the last speaker, I'll try to be brief, not to keep you here too long. Now, in my presentation, I look at ethnic cleansing as a geopolitical strategy that Russian and Ottoman empires used as they clashed in the Caucasus and the eastern vilayets of the Ottoman Empire. After a brief historical outline, I will attempt to show that as part of their geopolitical strategy, both empires supported dissenting nations living in each other's territory, a strategy that blurred the distinction between imperial defense policies and internal security practices, producing genocidal policies directed against predominantly Christian Armenians, Assyrians, and Pontic Greeks in Anatolia or Western Armenia, as well as predominantly Muslim Circassians, Chechens, Ingush, and other peoples in North Caucasus. This presentation will focus on geopolitical rather than interethnic or interreligious rationale for the genocides, and will analyze the policies of the two empires in the wider context of geopolitical rivalry in the late 19th and early 20th century. I make use of the comparative method, which allows us to understand and compare basically in order to discover similarities, relations between these processes, and even causality. Now, comparative method is a very widely used method in political science, which is my background, but it's very controversial when it's applied to genocide studies, as each victim nation claims their experience to be unique, and it is. With each, and here I quote Shaw, with each additional genocide having to be painstakingly added to the canon, often after political campaigning as well as scholarship, unquote. In order to justify the use of comparative method, I make two hypotheses and a remark before proceeding. Now, my first hypothesis is that genocide is not a purely domestic issue, with other states acting as bystanders, nor can it be reduced to geopolitical competition between big powers. It has to be understood in the intersection of both. Internal and external, domestic and foreign factors should be taken into account and not seen as separate. Genocide is often wrongly perceived as simply a problem of evil leaders or bad regimes. However, it should be understood as a process that doesn't only involve a subject, a perpetrator, and an object, a victim, but is mediated through internal and external enabling and disabling structures. Or, as Shaw, to quote him again, put it, we need to move from the subjectivity of the perpetrators to the structures of genocide, unquote. I will not go as far as to claim, like Levin, that genocidal continuities should be located in the logic of competing nation-states and that the nation-state system itself should be considered as a root of genocide. However, I will try to show that the prolonged war between the Ottoman and Russian empires and the use of other empires, minorities against them, are important factors that help explain their genocidal policies. Highlighting the importance of the international context, imperial struggles, influence of big powers, and state insecurity is of course not intended to play into the hands of Turkish or Russian nationalists by placing the blame for these events on external forces. My aim here is to show how these two genocides were a result of geopolitical strategies rather than spontaneous events, although happening in complex circumstances in which civilians are often not only victims of, but also participants in violence. My second hypothesis is that the genocide perpetrated by Russian and Ottoman empires were based on geopolitical imaginations. One such imagination was the organicist conception of state, which is basically the application of evolutionary biology to the field of politics. Long present in both empires, with the most radical version drawing full analogy with other forms of life, claiming that people living in a certain territory need to be annihilated to allow the expansion of another people, which is, for instance, then later on embodied in the concept of Lebensraum during preceding the Second World War and during the Second World War. Now, geopolitics as a discipline essentially developed as an imperial science which operated through essentialization of places, exotization of differences between areas, and totalization of spatial comparisons, according to John Agnew, the founder of critical geopolitics. It is not, therefore, just about taking over territory, but about physically and discursively erasing evidence of other people's presence and writing your history over theirs. Before delving into history, I would like to remark that genocides have often been wrongly and unjustly named after the biggest ethnic group. So Circassian genocide was actually the genocide of not only Circassians but also English, Chechen, and many other Muslim peoples of North Caucasus, while the Armenian genocide was a genocide of Armenians, Pontic Greeks, Assyrians, Caledonian Christians, and others. So I will be using the terms genocide of Caucasian Muslims and genocide of Anatolian Christians, which I believe are more inclusive. Now, to situate genocidal policies of Ottoman and Russian Empire into the Great Game, their imperial competition, I first have to situate this conflict within the context of wider international relations at the time. Ottoman and Russian Empire were engaged in one of the longest series of armed conflicts in European history. The Russo-Turkish Wars lasted from 1568 to the end of the First World War in 1918. Most of the wars were started by Russia, which was able to progressively chip away territory from the Ottoman state. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire found itself in desperate geopolitical situation, surrounded by enemies hungry for its territories in Balkans and Caucasus, sustaining great losses due to poor military organization, training, and equipment. The conflict between Russian and Ottoman empires assumed its greatest intensity in the second half of the 19th century. These were the Crimean War, the Siege of Pleona, battles of Kars and Erzurum, and so on. Christian empires forced the Ottoman Empire into several capitulations, which are basically concessions that compromised its sovereignty over its citizens as foreign powers declared themselves protectors of Christian minorities, like, for instance, Russia did in the case of the Armenian minority. And indeed, these minorities were instrumentalized to a certain extent and used against the empires in which they lived. Ottoman Empire was especially affected by the rise of nationalism in the Balkans, promoted by Christian empires, by the influx of Western missionaries, and rise in international economic relations with the West, which brought more influence on the minorities, especially the ones engaged in international trade, such as the Armenians. In 19th century Russia was backing revolts of Orthodox Christians in the Balkans, and they started doing the same in the eastern vilayets of the Ottoman Empire. And as Bloxham writes, Russian actions were so callous in their instrumentality, given the well-known pattern of Ottoman response to insurgent Christians, that they deserve a special place in the pantheon of imperial corresponsibility for the fatal deterioration of Turkish-Armenian relations. The Young Turks believed that Russians have made a deal with the Armenians, which included the carving out of an independent Armenian state out of the territory of the Ottoman Empire. I guess this cold is spreading. I'm sorry. In order to compare the two genocides, I should say a little bit more about the genocide of Anatolian Muslims. It was only after the surrender of Imam Shamil in 1859 that Russia was able to basically concentrate and focus all its military might in subduing Circassia between 1860 and 1864. During this period, most Circassians were either killed or internally resettled in Russia or expelled to either Persia or Ottoman Empire. Many other Caucasian people shared the same fate: the Adige, the Ubiks, Muslim Abkhazians, Chechens, Ingush. The Ubik, for instance, were linguistically and culturally completely annihilated, and all the villages of Shapshuks, for instance, were without exception razed and burned to the ground. The cleansing affected hundreds of thousands, and some claim that between 1 and 1.5 million people died or were displaced. The peoples of North Caucasus were only conquered when geopolitical, and I mean it in a quite literal sense of manipulating territory, when geopolitical practices were applied, when forests were cut down to prevent natives from hiding in them, when crops were burned to destroy local economy, and when roads were built to bring in the troops. And in these instances, the axe was just as important this instrument as the gun or the saber. hundreds of thousands were expelled from their native lands and shipped to the Ottoman Empire. Some were given a choice between internal resettlement and expulsion, which they mostly chose. These Muslims who were expelled by the expansion of the Russian Empire to the Caucasus are often referred to as muhajirs, which is Arab for refugees or immigrants. Now the Ottomans even encouraged this. They sent emissaries to encourage immigration of Caucasian Muslims from Russia, and they invited them to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman government made a promise that they would provide them with a better life. Now the Ottomans saw Circassians expelled from Russia as an instrument they can use for internal colonization of regions with significant Christian population. Thousands of Armenians were effectively evicted from their properties in favor of Muslim refugees, and the principle of creating a more thoroughly Islamized peasantry. Caucasian Muslims were put into houses from which Anatolian Christians were evicted. These refugees then lived in perpetual fear that their previous occupants will claim back their property, and this fear made them seek protection of the Ottoman state and motivated also their subservience to it. So many of them accepted Turkish nationalism as their ideology. Many of them joined the Young Turks movement or entered the army or the gendarmerie. And Ottoman genocidal policy here was actually a result of what I would call inter-imperial learning. So of learning from its own negative experiences of failed counterinsurgency in the Balkans, and positive, on the other hand, positive experiences of Russian Empire's successful counterinsurgency in the Caucasus. So they basically tried to apply Russian methods to quelling their rebellions in their own territory. And in some ways, the genocide of Caucasian Muslims was the precondition for the genocide of Christian minorities of Ottoman Empire. Firstly, it was only after Russia was able to subdue the peoples of Northern Caucasus that they started applying pressure on the borders of the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, and this is deeply ironic, is the fact that in the early stages of Russian-Circassian conflict, Russians would displace Circassians and resettle Armenians, Georgians, Ossetians, and other Caucasian Christians into their homes. And in 1860s, Circassians are mostly killed or displaced to the Ottoman Empire, and some of them, many of them, resettle into the houses of displaced Christian minorities. So again, Armenians, Pontic Greeks, Assyrians. A lot of them join and, as I said, are recruited into military units, which play an important role in the 1915 genocide. So to sum up the irony, the victims of the first genocide were accomplices in the second, and the accomplices of the first genocide became victims of the second one. To understand the geopolitical rationale behind these two genocides, it is important to understand what the geopolitical imaginations that underpin these genocidal policies were. And Tyner defines them as geopolitical discourses that serve as the basis and justification for political practices, including killings. These are the practices of othering, which provided fertile land for the extreme geopolitical solutions. Russia viewed Circassians as noble savages, as peoples organized in tribes possessing no written language, while the Ottomans viewed Armenians as savage nobles, basically as people who are socioeconomically advanced, but according to their standards and their morale, morally corrupt. Although the Millet system put restrictions and heavy taxes on its Christian subjects, Armenians were often able to achieve better socioeconomic status than Turks, Kurds, and other Muslims, which was a source of frustration to the latter. And Armenians were perceived as an enemy in the context of the ethno-religious purification of the Turkish state called for by the Young Turks. As Bloxham explains, Hamidian massacres at the end of the 19th century had a nationalistic but also an economic dimension. And I quote, "Simple jealousies were important as were Muslim perceptions of improper Christian advancement and behavior," unquote. Policies of othering and exclusion must be understood as a crucial geopolitical moment that prepared the ground for policies of erasure and rewriting of space. On the other hand, from the imperialist point of view, the genocide of Anatolian Christians was a geopolitical necessity, whereas the genocide of Caucasian Muslims was a geopolitical luxury. Armenians were perceived as a dangerous internal enemy that could be used by external enemies to wreak havoc in the empire, while Circassians were much less organized and supported and more isolated. Armenians were a threat to the existence of the Ottoman Empire, Circassians were a threat to the Russian Empire's expansion, but from the point of view of its existence, a mere nuisance. And to conclude, I claim that erasure and rewriting of space was the ultimate rationale behind the two genocides. Ottoman and Russian empires, with their religious and ethnic diversity, had to disappear, had to be erased so that Turkey and Russia, with their uniformity, could project and inscribe their national mythologies into the territories they have taken over. The genocides effectively destroyed the Circassian state and prevented the establishment of an Armenian state in its historical borders. Although there was talk of an Armenian state at the Lausanne Conference in 1923, just as there was of a Kurdish state, for instance, it was merely a bargaining chip, as no big power was ready to commit an army for the protection of a small and fledgling state. Tyner uses the term anti-geographies to denote erasure of space, which is not just symbolic erasure, but also a very practical one. Now, the negative effect of destruction, killings, displacement on the economy was obvious, and it brought along the near collapse of agriculture in North Caucasus and the collapse of trade in Anatolia. The two empires went as far as undermining themselves in order to put into practice their geopolitical imaginations. Finally, genocide produces not just domestic, but international outcomes. It fundamentally alters relations between states within a region and beyond. Through genocidal practices, Russian and Ottoman empires did not weaken just their respective internal enemies, but indirectly also each other, as they couldn't rely anymore on a friendly minority within their enemies' borders. This imperial competition, exercised through extreme practices of ethnic cleansing, in turn sowed the seeds of future geopolitical instability and inter-ethnic violence in the Balkans and Caucasus, which, after being kept under the lid by the Cold War, re-emerged in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. To this day, these two regions remain politically volatile, economically weak, and with little prospects for regional integration. Thank you.
Again, a very fascinating paper combining developments both in Russia and the Ottoman Empire, with again implications for current political situation in those two spaces. I'm sure it's provoked a number of questions. Yes?
Circassians, maybe I heard in another terminology. Who are they? Where are they? Where were they? And where did the Turks come? Turks are supposed to be in Mongolia, Tatars, Cherkesses, these people. How come, all the time it's in my mind, how come they jumped suddenly to Europe, borders of Europe, this side? They belong to the other side in a simple Greek. Where did they come from, the Turks?
Yeah, it's a complicated question that I guess demands a long answer, but it's easier to tell a little bit more about the Circassians. So they're basically, maybe you know them by the sort of a Russian name, which is the Cherkess. Some people know them more by that name. So it's basically a federation of tribes. So they're a Caucasian nation. They speak a Caucasian language, and they sort of settled the area between what is now northern Abkhazia, all the way to Krasnodar in Russia. Sort of around Krasnaya Polyana, if you're familiar with the geography of Russia.
Muslims?
Yes, yes. Initially, of course, pagan, but were Islamized. I think, was it the 17th century? I don't know, maybe.
It's quite late anyway, yes.
Yes,
late.
relatively late, yes. I think only the Ingush were Islamized later than the Circassians. Chechens via Dagestan pretty early on, but I think Ingush and Circassians the latest in the Caucasus.
And the Turks, where did they come from?
I'm not a historian, and I'm not specializing in the Turks, but I think you mentioned sort of the steppes and association with Mongolians.
We're talking about Turkey.
Yeah, the origin of the Turks. They're not supposed to be in that area. In my mind, they are Mongols and Tatars and these kind of tribes. They should be in Mongolia, in Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, that area, not in the Europe area.
Well, I think just very briefly, it's very significant that there was a very large migration westwards, really relatively early, with the result that already during the Abbasid Caliphate, we see that there were many Turkish elements, particularly in the army. There's a very famous incursion into Armenia, which of course at this time was part of the Abbasid Caliphate, in the year 851. And I'm sure that some of you will maybe recall from your history in school days and so on, that the Abbasid leader of this incursion, which created great devastation throughout the Armenian lands, was Buha, and he was a Turkish general under the Abbasid flag. And as I say, in this period already, from the 8th, 9th century onwards, we have major migration of Turks into the eastern part of the Abbasid Caliphate. And this, of course, simply becomes compounded over succeeding centuries with the Seljuks, other movements of different sorts of Turkish tribes into that broader area. So it's a long, drawn-out process. But obviously here we're talking largely about the situation in the Ottoman Empire, which of course doesn't come into existence until the 15th century. But you see that they've been settled in different parts of the Near East for a much longer time. Just by way of background. Yes?
I have a comment and a question. The comment is, some of the Circassians went quite a bit south, and I remember seeing them in Jordan. They were very trusted people. The king's palace was all guarded by the Circassian soldiers. They looked very Russian with their special uniforms. And if you went to small villages, the head of the villages were Circassians. They were very trusted in governments and in things. I don't know when did they get there, but I think probably in the early 20s, 10s and 20s, maybe earlier.
Well, the beginnings of the Circassian community in Jordan actually go to 1860s.
Okay.
And
yeah.
It's still one of the biggest Circassian communities, basically. And, I know that the mosque that was built with the contributions of Circassians in Amman is one of the grandest and the most luxurious in Jordan. So it's quite a wealthy and quite a notable community.
My question is different now. During the Armenian massacres or the deportation, what role did Russia play in that? It was on their border. Did they play anything in that? Did they try anything? Good, bad, or indifferent? What was their interest in that?
I'm just curious, what particular period?
Well, 1914, all the genocide
yeah.
and expulsion of all the Armenians from eastern Turkey. What did the Russians feel at the time? I mean, what was their role?
I mean, the genocide happened in the context of the First World War. So there was a war on the Caucasian Front between the Ottoman Empire and Russia, the Russian Empire. Of course, you know that in 1917, then up until the 1917, Russian Empire was engaged in the First World War. After the revolution, basically they withdrew. But up until then, they basically retreated. So they didn't have any means of assisting Armenians, as far as I know. So they didn't play a very active role in those times, which is sort of, but it's controversial. Just like the role of the German Empire, for instance. Some say that the Ottoman Empire was tacitly supported by the German Empire in their genocidal policies. Other historians would just suggest that Germany was actually against it, and it's quite interesting that the genocide from a very geopolitical and geoeconomical perspective hurt German interests in the region, because during the genocide many crucial Armenian railroad workers working on the Baghdad Railway, which was of crucial importance to the German Empire for projecting their political power into the Middle East. So basically, by killing all these workers, German interests also suffered. So it was a very, very complex situation in a way.
Yes. Okay. The Turks offered the Christians all kinds of pardons if they converted from Christianity to Islam. The Russians offer the Muslims to accept Christianity and forego the genocide.
Well, the Russians basically, it was different. There was no systematic approach towards Circassians in the 1860s.
Religion was not an issue in Russia.
I'm sorry?
Religion was not the issue in Russia.
It was. So a lot of communities were offered a choice, either to be resettled into the interior of Russia, but that also implied religious conversion. So either you accepted Christianity and got resettled somewhere else, or you had to leave the country. That was basically the alternative that Circassians were faced with, and for that matter, all the Muslims of the Northwest Caucasus.
So it was more than geopolitical, it was more religious. The whole thing, wherever you go, the genocide in Russia and genocide in Turkey were religious, not geopolitical.
I think that sort of the different religion made Caucasian Muslims appear as untrustworthy to the Russians, and they tended to see them as a geopolitical threat because their religion was the same religion as their enemy's religion, so as the Ottoman Empire's religion. So they were constantly afraid that the Ottomans will play the religious card in trying to exert influence in the Northern Caucasus, which was the same fear that the Ottomans had with the Russian Empire, basically.
But ultimately, these religions are going to go to war. The third world war will be a war of religions. and the ones that will get wiped out will be the Christians.
I would say it would be the capitalists, and the capitalism is religion. Well, we'd have that debate forever.
Any more questions? If not, then why don't you join me in a very warm round of applause for all the presenters.